In Dark Souls, certainty is never something the player is given directly. The world rarely states what anything is with confidence. Instead, meaning is assembled from fragments, item descriptions, environmental storytelling, enemy placement, and dialogue that always feels like it's pointing towards something, but that something is just out of reach. Even the gods speak in a way that feels incomplete. Not exactly deceptive, but shaped, like truth filtered through perspective rather than delivered as fact. Nothing is fully explained, and because of that, the player is never just progressing through a narrative, they're constantly interpreting it. Every action becomes a form of reading. Every decision becomes an act of constructing meaning from uncertainty. And over time, that interpretive gap becomes where most of the game's theories live. I'd come across one of these theories, this one posted by a user on Reddit by the name of the Spirit Force. While the theory I've seen in variations, this version focuses on a specific question about two figures who seem to define the world's metaphysical structure, Kingseeker Frampt and Darkstalker Koth. At first glance, they appear to represent opposing ideologies, but the theory asks something more unsettling than just simple opposition. Not whether they disagree, but whether the distinction between them itself is part of a larger system shaping how the player understands the choice that's given to them. On the surface, their roles appear clearly divided. Dark Souls presents Frampt as the serpent aligned with continuation. He encourages the player to link the first flame, to preserve the Age of Fire, and to maintain the structure of the world as it currently exists. His framing emphasizes duty, inheritance, necessity. Koth, by contrast, presents rupture. He speaks of the dark as something suppressed rather than absent, and he frames the Age of Fire as a distortion that must end for something more true, the Age of Humans, to emerge. Two serpents, two interpretations, two endings that appear mutually exclusive, but what makes the theory compelling is not their opposition, it's how precisely that opposition is framed to deceive the player. This is where the conditional structure of their appearances becomes important. Koth only appears if the player has actively avoided or bypassed Frampt's guidance. He's not present as a competing voice from the start. He emerges specifically in response to a path that excludes Frampt. Frampt, in turn, reacts negatively when the player circumvents his intended route of progression. If the player bypasses him or rejects his guidance, he becomes hostile and withdraws, effectively closing off his interpreted role. What this creates is not a neutral branching system, but a mutual exclusion mechanism. Each serpent functions as a fail-safe condition against the other. They don't coexist as equal guides, they alternate based on the player's alignment, ensuring that one narrative frame is always active while the other is suppressed. The structure does not simply present choice, it produces the appearance of choice while preventing both interpretations from ever being simultaneously interrogated. In effect, the player is never allowed to hold both perspectives at once, long enough to question the system itself. This is where I want to introduce an external framing mechanism. As I was reading through the thread, it sparked an idea. It reminded me of something out of an online comic, The Order of the Stick by Rich Burlew. In a scene featuring Haley, who's a morally flexible rogue, she's trying to explain deception to the paladins surrounding her who are lawful good, and she's becoming frustrated. Her explanation is that the con is a shell game. It's not about tricking someone into choosing the wrong choice or the right choice, it's about convincing them that the structure of the game itself is legitimate, and that there's a meaningful certainty to be gained by participating in the game at all. This idea maps directly onto what Frampt and Koth begin to resemble under closer inspection. Both serpents present themselves as guides to truth. Both offer imposing interpretations of the same world, and both assume that the player is engaged in a system where those interpretations are meaningful choices. Frampt says, continue the cycle. Koth says, end the cycle. But both rely on the assumption that the cycle is something that can be meaningfully chosen between. That's the shell game structure. Not deception about the outcome, but acceptance of the premise that the game being played is real in the way it claims to be. In this reading, Frampt and Koth are not simply opposing forces, they're responses to a deeper condition, the presence of stasis. Frampt appears when the world can still be extended forward without collapse. Koth appears when the continuation has already been disrupted or refused. Neither is truly concerned with fire or dark as moral absolutes. These terms become language applied to a more fundamental condition, whether the world is still moving or whether it's begun to stagnate. This reframes the player's role entirely. The player is not simply choosing between ideologies or endings. They are not simply choosing whether or not to kindle the first flame or to bring in the age of darkness. They are the metaphorical stagehands that show up when stagnant structures must be broken down or reset. The lords are not just rulers of mythic remnants, they are points where history has become fixed, where power, identity, and meaning have stopped transforming. They are stable structures in a world that otherwise resists stability, much like the dragons in the Age of Ancient that Gwyn himself fought. And by repeating the act of defeating the sitting lords, we continue the narrative progression. It's not just conquest, it's the removal of structures that have become too settled to continue functioning. Or, to use a colloquialism from my mom, it's to remove things that have become too big for their britches. That's why we look at the player as a stagehand. The player does not maintain order in a governing sense. They do not preserve balance or enforce justice. They do not author the story of their own game. Instead, they repeatedly enter systems that have reached a state of stasis, and they break them down so something new can be set in place. Like stagehands in a theater production, they are responsible for either resetting or striking the set once the act is over, and preparing the space for the next scene. They are not the story, but they make sure the story can continue. At this point, Frampt and Koth stop being purely ideological figures and begin to function as interpretive systems layered into the same underlying process. Frampt frames breakdown as preservation. Koth frames breakdown as liberation, but both are describing the same structural requirement. Stagnant forms must be dismantled for the cycle to proceed. From that perspective, they are not orchestrators of the events. They are the post-event narrators who arrive once the set has already been struck or replaced, offering competing explanations for what the transition meant. One calls it preservation. One calls it liberation. But neither is present at the moment of change itself. So, the unsettling implication is not that there's a hidden intelligence working with, working against, or controlling Gwyn or the cycle. It's that the world itself produces conditions where stasis accumulates, and something must break it for movement to continue. And only afterwards does interpretation arrive to explain what that breaking meant. So the real question is no longer who's controlling the serpents, or which serpent is right. It becomes something closer to what kind of world produced a structure where meaning only appears after the fact, and then insists those meanings were always part of the choice. And in that space, the player is never truly choosing between truths. They are participating in a system where interpretation is layered over structural necessity, like the shell game, where the real trick was never the outcome, but the assumption that the rules of the game were ever stable to begin with. Thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. This is one of those theories that I haven't seen a whole lot of in video essay form. Hopefully you enjoyed it. The fact that the gods have been conning us is pretty well accepted in the community. but we haven't really looked too much at Koth and Framt. Anyway, like I said, I hope you enjoyed this, and like always, I love you, even if I don't know you. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you again soon.